Okay, Corel Painter is basically one big brush engine. You can go over to the right hand corner here, press on the brush that you already have selected, and you can see all the brushes that you have to choose from. And then on the right of it, you can basically have all the little alterations that you can make to this brush, all the little different variations that you can have, whether it's a soft brush, or whether it's a real round or a real oil smeary brush. So you can basically pick from anywhere from a real Bristol brush to your oil painting brush, to acrylics, to sponges. There's tons of brushes to pick from. Instead of running down all through these, which obviously you can kind of do on your own, there's a couple brushes that you kind of need to pay attention to that are a little tricky, and they're almost like special effects brushes. To begin with, we'll go ahead and kind of talk about the watercolor brush. And I'll go ahead and select watercolor, and right now it's set for runny, wet, flat. And I'm going to pick a darker color so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. And once you basically have picked a watercolor brush, and we'll go ahead and get rid of this layer. Okay, once you've picked a watercolor brush, and then you go ahead and actually make a mark with it, first of all, you'll notice that a lot of the watercolor brushes act really slow. It can really slow down the engine. Another thing you'll notice is, especially with the wet washes, is once I'm done with the stroke, it actually continues to move, just like normal watercolor will. And they'll actually interact with each other also. So I can go over here and use a little magenta color, and then make another stroke on top of it. And just like with the real watercolors, they'll kind of like interact with each other and kind of swirl with each other, and they'll also continue to kind of bleed and move. You can look at the little icon right here and see this little drop symbol continuing to move. That means that basically the watercolor mark that you make is continuing to bleed, to move down the paper, just like it would in the real world. And when you get to the point where you want it just exactly where it's at, you want to just go up to layers, and you can click on dry watercolor layer. And that'll basically stop that kind of dripping process. And you'll also notice that right off the bat, when you apply a watercolor layer, when you apply watercolor, it automatically makes it into a separate layer. And what's tricky with the watercolors is you can only work with watercolors on a watercolor layer. In other words, if I go over here to, well, let's say chalk, and I want to make a stroke, well, automatically it'll tell me only watercolor brushes can be used on watercolor layers. So that's what you need to know about the watercolor brushes, just the basic rundown, and then you on your own can kind of play around with all the different kinds of watercolor techniques that you can do with it, which is pretty huge. I'm going to go ahead and clear the palette here and talk about some of the other brushes that can be a little bit tricky and kind of confusing. Next is the pattern pen. And the pattern pen does exactly what it implies. It's basically it makes patterns, kind of similar to the image hose brush, but much more in a linear kind of fashion. And you can see right now we have a little flower thing that it's basically drawing. And when you want to change the pattern that it's making, well, first of all, just like with the other brushes on the right, you have the variance level of it, so you can kind of choose exactly what kind of how you want to apply the pattern. You want to go over to the selectors over here where you have your paper selector, and this is where, right underneath the paper selector is where you have some of these things that you can basically draw with. Really quickly, I can kind of show you some of the ones that they have. They have like a jungle vine one. Let me go ahead and change the variance there so it's a little bit easier for you to read. We have a jungle vine one. We have hens and chicks, which is basically like a flower. And we have floral fabric, decorative ginkgo fill pen, little tree branches, tree trunk pen, my favorite, the silver tube pen. little ducks, which are a little bit hard to see until you really increase the brush size on it. That, yes, there are little ducks there. We have gravel and lotus petals. Now underneath this little palette is a bunch of selections, and some of them are the pattern pen and some of them are also the FX brush. You can see right now I have Jungle Neon selected, and it automatically switches over to the FX Neon brush. And a lot of these are this kind of like laser kind of thing that you can draw with. If I pick a furry brushes, automatically it switches over to the cloner brush, and that allows you to actually do a furry cloner. It's kind of a mixture of the FX brushes, the pattern pens, the image hose brushes. So they have an orange neon and a red neon and vivid stripes. And I'm not going to hit on all of them here, obviously. You can kind of play around with your own. That pretty much sums it up for the pattern pens and the FX brushes. And we've kind of already talked about the image hose brush. It's kind of like a chapter all onto itself. That's why I did a separate tutorial on that.